Blog Talk Radio.
Mi chiamo Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit, Neye AKANFO NANASOM Da, Medinde Ojirafo, Kwesi Radnem Bata Akan, Akwamumai Maruka, Itifi Mu, Ojirafo, Ojiramai Mu. Greetings to all Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit, people meaning Africans, black people. Today is AKANFO NANASOM Day, Ancient Authentic Akan Ancestral Religion Day. My name is Ojirafo, Kwesi Radnem Bata Akan, Ojirafo of the Akwamu Nation in North America within Ojiraman, the purified nation, Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit people in the Western Hemisphere. Yet I say we thank you once again for tuning into the broadcast. We have opened up the chat room. If you have any questions or comments in the chat room, you must log in as a user in order to interact. If you do not have a username, you can sign up for one quickly in Blog Talk. If you have any questions or comments on the phone line, simply hit the number 1 so that we can see that your hand is raised. We typically have 4 broadcasts on a weekly basis. We have AKANFO NANASOM, Ancient Authentic Akan Ancestral Religion, on Joda on Monday nights, where we deal specifically with the Akan expression of ancestral religion. First and foremost, because we are Akan. Secondly, because of the misinformation being propagated regarding Akan ancestral religion, cosmology, culture, ritual practice, and so forth from individuals on the continent of Afuraitkaitnit who have been infected with white culture and therefore have woven those infections into their presentation of Akan culture and cosmology and so forth, as well as individuals in the Western Hemisphere who have been misinformed as well. So we deal with ancient, authentic Akan ancestral religion, which takes us back to our ancestral origins in ancient Kanat, which is a title of ancient Nubia. Ancient Kanat, our people migrated from that region after the fall of KAMIT a couple of thousand years ago, migrated west, established ourselves in the western part of the continent, reestablished Kana civilization or Akana civilization in the west, the Empire of Ghana. 1,000 years later, some of our people migrated further south, reestablished Akana civilization in the forest belt and savanna regions, and therefore we maintained culture until a few hundred years later. Some of our people were taken from those regions and forced into North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and Europe during the Kesee, the Great Perversity, the enslavement era. This is how some of our people ended up in the Western Hemisphere. So we deal with ancient, authentic Akan ancestral religion that we have maintained within our blood circles wherever we have migrated or were forced to migrate anywhere in the world. In the North America, the Akan tradition is called hoodoo, from the Akan term undu, meaning medicine from roots, trees, plant life. It also means to become heavy with the spirit through spirit conjure, spirit possession, and so forth. In Suriname, South America, the Akan tradition is called Winti. In Jamaica, the Akan tradition is called Obia, and so forth. So we deal with ancient, authentic Akan ancestral religion on Joda Monday nights. On Abinada Tuesday nights, we have Ojira, which means purification. We deal with ancestral religion in general, not just the Akan expression, but ancestral religion in general, showing how ancestral religion, as we call Nanasom, Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit, or African ancestral religion, impacts every aspect of our lives. Ancestral religion, whether it's the Akan expression or any other expression, in essence is the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance. That means through ritual, we incorporate those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to incorporate in order to harmonize our thoughts, intentions, and actions with divine order. And through ritual, we reject those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to reject in order to restore balance to our thoughts, intentions, and actions, and thus realign ourselves with divine order. So the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance are the expansive and contractive poles of ancestral religion. we state that Ojira, purification, operationalizes Nanasom. Purification operationalizes our practice of ritually incorporating divine law and ritually restoring divine balance so that we can execute our divine function in creation, uphold our culture. Our ancestral culture as Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people, our way of life is to execute the divine function we have been given to execute in creation by the Supreme Being and align every thought, intention, and action with divine order every moment of every day. And when we make legitimate mistakes, we engage the ritual process to incorporate divine law and restore divine balance so that we can get back on track with aligning every thought, intention, and action every moment in harmony with divine order every day. Our culture is the divine acceptance, the law, the love of order, and the divine rejection, the divine hate of disorder. So this is why we seek to align every thought, intention, and action with divine order. Purification, Ojira, operationalizes Nanasom ancestral religion so that we can engage the ritual process so that we can align ourselves and realign ourselves on a consistent basis. So we deal with text from KAMIT, ritual practices, purification of understanding of culture, ritual, ancestral cosmology, various aspects of ancestral tradition. This is how ancestral religion impacts every day of our lives, every moment of our lives. On Egua Da Marketplace Day, which is Wednesday, Awukuda Akuada, we have Egua Marketplace showcasing Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit businesses, organizations, and institutions, those who are serving the Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit community, those who maintain their ancestral religious practices in the context of their service to the community. And of course, we have showcased many businesses, organizations, and institutions, and we will have more coming on. We also talk about the philosophical foundation for economic development, which we call OKRA, our economic development model, which is rooted in our ancestral religious values. It is therefore a holistic approach to economic development for Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. We talk about the philosophical foundation and cosmological foundation for sound economic development. And we have our economic development model, which you can download for free from our website. On Yauda, which is Thursday, also Yada Abada Thursday, we have Amain Sim, Affairs of the Nation, specifically dealing with the Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit nation in the Western Hemisphere, Ojiraman, the purified nation, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people in the Western Hemisphere. We deal with our issues that confront us every day on a regular basis, but we deal with our issues and confront them and resolve them a Maniye perspective, a nationist perspective. We deal with Amaniye, which is Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, or African Black nationism, the purification of nationalism. We recognize the reality that an Omain, a nation, is a living, breathing entity, no different than an organ that has children, which are the cells that support the organ's functions. The organ is an entity governed by specific abosom, Orisha divinities, Vodou, and the cells support the organ's structure, its function, while aligning with the forces that govern that organ at the same time, the divine forces that govern that organ at the same time. We are cells within the great divine body of the Supreme Being as Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. Those of us who've been forced into the Western Hemisphere, we have coalesced in this region of the Earth Mother's body, blended ancestral blood circles in this specific region of the Earth Mother's body, taken advantage of and aligned ourselves with the unique expression and emanation of energy from this region of the Earth Mother's body, aligned ourselves with the plant life, animal life, mineral life of this region of the Earth Mother's body, taking these things into our systems through consumption of food as well as medicine and so forth. We've also aligned ourselves with the unique manifestation of the abosom, the Orisha, the Vodou, the forces in nature as they manifest in this region of the Earth Mother's body. And because we have taken that in and blended ancestral blood circles, we have forged a locative identity rooted in that unique coalescing in this region. We are therefore Ojiraman, the purified nation Afurakani people in the Western Hemisphere, and we have a specific approach to our issues based on our locative identity. Resolving our issues in a harmonious fashion rooted in our ancestral religious values. This is what we deal with when we're talking about Amaniye nationism, which is the purification of nationalism. So we deal with that on Amain-Sim Affairs of the Nation, which is on Yauda Thursday nights. So tonight we're going to get into MFEFO, Spiritics, the Spiritics of age, and Afurakani African relationships. When we talk about Spiritics, we're talking about the spiritual politics of a specific issue. Afe means age in the Akan language. MFEFO means the groups of people or group of people who are around the same age compatriots and so forth in the same age group. We want to deal with the spiritics of age in relationships, male and female relationships. That deals with chrono-biological age, but also life cycles and solar cycles, the Afe Kesee, the great year, and so forth. The cycles we're in, inclusive of our transcarnational cycles in the context of reincarnation, informs our maturity level and the measure of our compatibility with one another. And of course, this dovetails with this particular year. We are in the year 13,018 in our Akwamu Akan calendar. Of course, our year begins on the equinox, the specific Atemet equinox, autumn equinox, the first day of fall. We have our 7-day New Year celebration, which is September 16th through the 22nd, or September 17th through the 23rd, depending on the year. Our first day of the new year is the first full day of the equinox. This year, it began on September 22nd, so our New Year's observance was September 16th through the 22nd, and the last day of the observance is the first day of our new year, which was the first day of our year 13,018. And of course, we do not track time based on a fictional cartoon character who never existed in any form or of any race. Jesus, Yeshua ben Pandera, Isa, and so forth. And of course, today is the foolish, hollow day, talking about this fictional cartoon character who never existed. And of course, we've done our Kukutuntun, the ancestral jurisdiction, proving that Jesus never existed, Yeshua ben Pandera never existed, Muhammad, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Solomon, Sheba, Menelik, David, Moses, Aaron, Buddha, Brahman, Yahweh, Allah, the various fictional cartoon characters, and so forth. Now, but our year started on 13,018, started on September 22nd, over 3 months before the Gregorian calendar, New Year on January 1st. We're in the midst of a 26,000 Afe Kesee great year cycle, hence the year is beginning with 13,000. This particular year began on a Fida, which was a Friday, and of course Friday or Fida is governed by the female Abosom Afi, which is a title of Cheche in Akan that's also pronounced Het-Her in ancient Kemet, Het-Heru. She's also called Fait in ancient Kemet. She's also called Minminit in ancient Kemet. She's called Oshun in the Yoruba tradition, Azili or Ezuli in the Vodun tradition, and so forth. Because the first day of the year, 13,018, landed on the day that's governed by the planetary body in which Afi possesses and governs, that shapes and colors the nature of this particular solar cycle, this 365 and a quarter day cycle. It's an Afi type year. And of course, we have coming up in relation to that, we have our first annual Happy Merit retreat in February, dealing with Afuraitkaitnit, manhood and womanhood, relationships, the balance of Afurakani manhood, Afuraitkaitnit womanhood. We'll be having the Oberema workshops based on our book, Oberema Afurakani Manhood. I will be conducting that with the brothers at the retreat. Dr. Iya Adjua will be conducting the Obaatine Afuraitkaitnit Womanhood workshop based on our book, Obaatine Afuraitkaitnit Womanhood. We will also have joint sessions as well for Patah Sasatim and other joint sessions for that weekend. So that will be shaping and molding Afuraitkaitnit manhood and womanhood for Ojira mind. So when we leave that conference, we'll be rooted in these proper notions of manhood and womanhood. Our attendees will be able to go out and share this information, teach this information in workshops and other formats to the community and so forth. But it's about nation building from an ancestrally religious, grounded perspective. And this is the first annual retreat dealing with that. So it's all connected to this energy of the year. And we also, of course, are doing this particular broadcast dealing with a specific aspect often neglected when people are talking about relationships, the age factor and the spiritics of age. But we want to deal with cycles and their effect on our maturity level, not just physically, but spiritually, so we can have a better understanding about the impact that cycles have on relationships. I'm going to pull up some information real quick. Okay, so in the Akan tradition, there are different major cycles. Of course, the 7-day cycle, the Nawotwe, is a major cycle governed by the solar, lunar, and planetary bodies which govern the 7-day week. And we are named after the divinities. We have Akradin, or soul names, that derive from the deities that animate or possess the solar, lunar, and planetary bodies which govern the 7-day week. And because of that, we're shown, and it's an indication when we're born on a specific day, that we were assigned to a specific deity pre-incarnation. And therefore, we are born on that day to indicate to the community that this is the divinity that our Kra, or Krawa, our soul, our divine consciousness, the divinity dwelling in the head region, was assigned to that specific divinity. So we have major cycles that revolve around that 7-day week, but then we have greater cycles as well. For example, of course, you have the Krada, or soul day, the birthday, which is Awoda. 7 days later, if you're born on a Awusida Sunday, Akwesida, then 7 days later, on the 7th or the 8th day, it's 7 days, but then we don't have a zero, so the final day becomes the next day cycle. The next Awusida, the next Akwesida, quote-unquote, Sunday, that's when we have our Dinto, or the naming ceremony for the child. That's a first major cycle, first major passage, transformation for the child, receiving the name, the set of sound vibrations that they will be referred to, of course, throughout the course of their lives by the community. That's an imprint on the child. That imprint imprints the spirit of the child, and they begin to develop based on that collection of sound vibrations that every time they hear it, every time they speak it, every time they contemplate it, that specific configuration of sound vibrations affects their spirit, body in a harmonious fashion, and awakens the powers that they have, the potencies that they have inherited from their matriclan abosom, patriclan abosom, matriclan deity, patriclan deity, that gives them this unique configuration of energy they need to use to execute their function in the world. Your name unlocks that. Those sound vibrations, just like sound vibrations can break a glass if someone sings, different configurations of sound vibrations have different effects upon your organs, your cells, and so forth, and the unique configuration of sound vibrations that makes up your true name affects your spirit in a harmonious fashion. So that's the first passage that after the first week of life, receiving that Kradim, the soul name, as well as the Dimpa, the formal name, and so forth. But then we have greater cycles. The next major cycle is that shift into early adulthood, that shift into puberty. Now, prior to that, for example, you have the father and you have the mother. The father contributes DNA material. The mother contributes DNA material and so forth, genetic material. They also contribute the patriclan, the energy of the patriclan divinity that has protected the patriclan ancestresses and ancestors for thousands of years. That divine force that animates the sperm cell of the father carries that energy connected to the child. The divine matriclan divinity the abosom, the female divinity that has protected the matriclan ancestresses and ancestors that nurtured them for thousands of years, animates the ovum cell that's contributed by the mother. So she not only contributes the genetic material physiologically, but also the energy of the matriclan abosom or the abusi abosom. That energy is contributed to the child as well. The child has the energy of the patriclan or ejabosom, patriclan divinity, and the matriclan divinity, the abusi abosom, carries that within their spirit body. As they're growing and developing, and they're going out and going to the river on a regular basis every year on their Krada, their soul day, and engaging in the AKARA, or the soul washing ceremony and so forth, ritual cleansing and so forth, as they're growing year after year, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old and so forth, the parent engages that process of invoking the divinity that governs Kra, invoking the divinity that governs the patriclan divinity and so forth, and engages the ritual process. Once the child reaches puberty, there's a shift that takes place. Whenever you have a shift in energy, there's a commensurate shift in responsibility. So there's a shift that takes place biologically, and there's also a shift that takes place energetically. So once the child reaches puberty and their bodies begin to change, and they have the capacity now to produce mature sperm cells as a male, and they have ovum cells that can be cells that can be fertilized as a female. Now they have something that they didn't have before. They have the infrastructure now wherein they are empowered to bring an ancestral spirit back into the world. They had the energy of the matriclan and patriclan abosom divinities prior to reaching puberty, but they did not have the physiological infrastructure to wield that power to help bring an ancestor or an ancestress back through copulation, to bring a spirit back into the world through the fertilization of an ovum. Now that they have that infrastructure, there's a shift in energy and increase in responsibility. Many of us understand that we must ritualize that process, imprint that responsibility onto the spirit, the ajuni, the mind of the child, the male or female, so they can shift into this new responsibility. They're leaving childhood and they're moving into young adulthood. So we have that ritual process where we have manhood and womanhood training, not just teaching specific skills and so forth, but also ritual training. That's a shift in responsibility. And they begin to engage that process and wield the energy that they have inherited ritually on their own. They can invoke the abosom on their own. They can engage ritual process with the ancestresses and ancestors on their own, even though the parents still evoke the ancestresses and ancestors, the NHOMA and so on forth, the shrines during ritual times and so forth. But children can lead some parts of certain ceremonies because they can begin to wield that power because they have the infrastructure to bring one of those ancestresses and ancestors or ancestors back through their own bodies and so forth. So that's that next phase. But then we start moving into the phase of physiological on the external side maturity. Once you're moving to that next 7-year phase, so you first have the first 7 years from 0 to 7. Once they reach 7, there's cognitive development. And in Akwamu Mine and Maroka Tifimu, the Akwamu Nation in North America, that's when they receive their Kradin Bosom shrine, the shrine for their Krawa, and the divinity that governs the Krawa, the soul, the divine consciousness. 7 years later, around the 14th year, is when they shift into that manhood and womanhood, early manhood and womanhood, puberty phase, and there's a shift and there's a ritualization of that process. In that next 7-year phase, we move into physiologically full development externally as far as growth and expansion of the physical body. It begins to solidify around the year 21, 22, when you're fully grown, you're no longer expanding. You concretize that size and shape and definition at that point. But something else takes place that continues. While externally you've completed a phase of development and a level of maturity, and you're a young man and a young woman, a young adult, and so forth, what also takes place is a shift over the next 7 years from 21 to 28. During that process, there's an internal development that continues to happen biologically. That internal development is the development of the brain, called Ehon in Akan. It's also called Amimini in Akan, the physical brain. It does not stop its development at 21 years old or 22 years old. It continues to develop up through around the 28th year and a little bit beyond. It depends on the person. This is why there's a shift around the 28th year. There's a coming into consciousness, a different level, expansion of consciousness around the 28th year. In the Akan tradition, that's when you first enter the threshold or cross the threshold of manhood and womanhood. Prior to that, you were a young adult, 21, 22 years old, fully grown externally, but still not reaching that level of maturity. By the time you turn 28, you have crossed the threshold into manhood and womanhood. 28 years old is the year also that the same day of the week that you were born, that comes around once again. That same day of the week that you're born, because every year that passes, of course, is 365 and a quarter days in a year. There are 7 days in a week. So, of course, that doesn't match up every year. So if you were born on Joda Monday night, every year on your birthday, your birth date is not going to fall on a Joda. Sometimes it's going to fall on a Benada Tuesday, Abinada. Sometimes it's going to fall on a Wukuda or Akuada Wednesday. It depends. But on the 28th year, always, the Awoda, the birth day, and the Krada, the soul day, they line up just like they did when you were born. That's an indication of the divinity and the energy of the divinity bathing the earth just like they did on the same birth date and the same soul day, just like they did 28 years earlier when you were born. But that's also a shift, because what happens is there's a maturing in the brain. Now, what's taking place within the brain, and this is very important with regard to that maturity level that we're talking about, with regard to this notion of the spiritics or spiritual politics of age and male and female relationships. People used to assume that once someone turned 18 or 19, 20, 21, because their body was full grown and they were mature, they're adult male, female, they can engage in certain business transactions, they can, in the white culture of the whites and their offspring, of course, they're drinking and smoking, doing everything else. In our culture, we've always understood that that shift had not taken place, and it's not until the 28th year when that alignment of the Awoda and the Krada, the birth date and the soul date, converge. We've always understood that. The whites and their offspring have now caught up with that reality, because through the study of neuroscience, they've understood and rediscovered, quote unquote, that the brain continues to develop after the 21st year. And it doesn't fully finish its development until around the 28th year, sometimes the 29th, around that time, on average around the 28th year, depending on the person, depending on males, females, and so forth. You have, as you're growing and developing, you have gray matter and white matter making up the brain primarily. When you're younger, the gray matter is more prominent and so forth. But then as you grow older, past 10 years of age and into early adulthood and so forth, the pruning process begins to take place. And there are more greater connections being developed within the white matter and less in the gray matter. And there's an exchange. There's an increase and expansion of the white matter and a decrease of the gray matter. And the connections being developed within the white matter are more widespread and allows the person to be more focused, more pointed in their focus and accuracy and regulating their emotions and everything else. So when someone is still in 21, 22, and so forth, they have these different synapses and different connections, but their focus is kind of all over the place. They're not focused. They don't seem, quote unquote, mature. They're open to a lot of different things, but they're also influenced by a number of different things. As the pruning process and the refinement process of the synapses happens 22, 23, 24, 25, all the way up until around the 28th year, then the brain becomes more focused, more fine-tuned, more refined, more sharp, and so forth. And then we enter into that adult phase physiologically. Prior to that, if, say, for example, someone's in their 30s and they're trying to interface or date someone who's 22 or 23, it doesn't matter how intelligent someone is, they can take in a great deal of information, memorize it, repeat it, memorize what they read, memorize what they see, and so forth. But with regard to focus, with regard to applying information, with regard to wisdom, wise choices, proper judgments, and so forth, you will see there is a deficit until the brain continues this pruning process until around the 28th year. Now, of course, it depends on what people do with that process and do with their brain after that. People can just, poison themselves or drink or engage in self-destructive behavior and not attempt to, stimulate themselves intellectually or spiritually and not take advantage of that process. But the process is taking place. But prior to that, they will notice that they're dealing with somebody who's mentally less mature. There is an imbalance in that relationship. That's why in our culture we don't engage in these kinds of widespread relationships with regard to distance with age. Even if you look back to the shift that takes place around the 14th year. Around the 14th year, of course, you move into puberty. There's a shift biologically, but with that shift comes a shift consciously. When people begin to engage in sexual activity between the years up around in their 20s and so forth, or some people in their late teens and into the 20s and so forth, they will notice not only do they have the infrastructure to bring an ancestral spirit back into the world, but when they begin to stimulate that life force energy that they've been given by Ra and Ra'et through the sexual activity, through the reproductive process, the procreative process, they would notice the effect upon their consciousness. And when people remember back to the time when they first became sexually active, they notice that they have more, their receptivity expands greatly, much greater than it was prior to their first sexual encounters. So they began to be able to attune to people, attune to the spirit of someone. You can attune to the spirit of the opposite sex. When people become manipulative, they begin to realize that they can project their energy and influence, or if they're brainwashed, they can even influence and control the mind of someone else. Brothers begin to realize they can influence heavily or control the mind of a female, projecting their energy. They don't even know what they're doing at that point. They just know they have that capacity once they began to engage in sexual activity. If the female isn't focused, she'll allow herself to be controlled by the energy being projected by the male because he's wielding this newfound energy that he's utilizing. In the reverse, it's the same is true with females. They know they have the capacity to influence males, and if the male is not focused, he'll fall for the female, do whatever she wants him to do. He's worried that she's not going to embrace him, so he'll do whatever he possibly can. Some of them will even engage in criminal activity and so forth just to attune to this female because they're projecting this energy through the apparatus of the reproductive organs, but they're wielding this newfound energy. They have the capacity to wield the energy that's been given to them by the patriclan and matriclan arbosome. Sometimes they're using that energy in a positive capacity to develop themselves. Sometimes they're using the residual energy, emanation of that energy for control purposes. But people understand that that takes place. Once you go through that shift, and there's a development physiologically, there's also a shift consciously, and you have the capacity to wield the energy in a different fashion than you did before you went through the puberty process. When you were 12 or 13, before puberty happened, you were intelligent, You could read, you could write, you could study, you could memorize different things, you could memorize speeches and everything else, but you did not have the capacity yet, physiologically, the infrastructure, or consciously, the capacity to wield that life force energy that's circulating through the reproductive organs that can also connect to the patriclan and matriclan on both of them. You did not have that capacity yet. That's a big shift. And the difference between the mindset of somebody who has that capacity and the mindset of somebody prepubescent is a totally different mindset. They're on a totally different level. That's incompatible, and of course, in our culture, somebody trying to deal with somebody prepubescent, that's pedophilia, and of course, we kill people in our culture who engage in that process. But we're talking, there's a reason for that. They have a stronger energetic output. They can wield control. They're like a big magnet that's influencing a small magnet. They can drag that small magnet around because they have a greater capacity to wield that energy. That small magnet can't drag the large magnet across the table. So that's what's taking place at the post-pubescent stage and the prepubescent, if you were to compare. But the same thing takes place when someone shifts into beyond 21 and so forth, before they turn 28, when they're in that age range of 21 to 28 and so forth, before they reach that shift in brain development, which they have not experienced yet. So they can't experience life at 22, 23, 24 cognitively the same way someone at 29, 30, 31, 32 and beyond can. They cannot experience life the same way. They do not have the same insight. They could stand next to somebody and go through the same thing that somebody is going through and follow the same person around all day long, and they will have different insights into what's taking place because they don't have that same focus. Their brain is not fully developed yet. Cognitively, the energy that we wield, we don't have the capacity to wield it at the same level yet. But once we shift beyond that 28th year, that we're on another level of cognitive development, but also the capacity to wield that life force energy as well. So somebody who's gone beyond the 28th year, and they're 29, 30, 31, 32, and they're trying to deal with someone who's 21, 22, 23, there's going to be an imbalance. There's not going to be a complementary balance. Now, people will engage in these relationships because, number one, we've been brainwashed in this culture, and we don't know the difference between the ages. Some people just understand instinctively that someone is less mature and someone is more mature, somebody's not into certain things and so forth. But when we're dumbed down and we don't understand what our function in creation is and our purpose and so forth, we don't care. We just want to be sexually active. We're attracted to somebody, and we're just forcing things to fit. Now, some people force things to fit because they're not trying to execute their function. They don't even understand consciously that they have a function. They just go through life not executing their function. Just like somebody going through life on drugs and so forth. And they'll say, well, our relationship is working. In reality, a relationship is not working if you're not executing the function you came into the world to execute. We have a purpose. Of course, the whites in our offspring do not have a purpose because they don't have a ka. A ka had a soul of divine consciousness. So this whole notion of purpose in relation to male and female relationships doesn't factor in with regard to them. But for us, purpose, or nkrabia, is supreme. So if your purpose is not in harmony with someone else's, your function is not in harmony with someone else's, you don't engage in that kind of relationship. If you're in a different phase of development than someone else is, it's not compatible. They haven't shifted into full adulthood or haven't crossed the threshold into adulthood, manhood, or womanhood when they're prior to that 28th year. So that's just an example. However, now when someone goes through that 28th year, as soon as you go through the 28th year or around that time on average, that shift takes place. Now you simply entered into or crossed the threshold of manhood and womanhood, full manhood, full womanhood. However, you have not experienced life as a man or woman. You just crossed the threshold. It's just like someone getting a degree in medicine or something like that and graduating, but they have not yet gone out and began to practice, or getting a certification in therapy, but they have not yet gone out and practiced, so they have not lived as a therapist yet. They have not engaged anyone. They haven't encountered their different mood swings and manifestations of bipolar 1 or 2 disorders and so forth, or schizophrenia, and how to deal with that. They've studied things and memorized things, but they have not yet engaged what they have learned. So once you cross into the threshold, 28 years old, around that time, now you need to live life and experience an entire solar cycle, both equinoxes, both solstices, impacting every aspect of your being, the life force energy of Ra and Ra'et, Yonkumpon and Yonkuntone, circulating through you as an adult male, as an adult female, a man or woman. You have to experience life in a full solar cycle so you can understand how to function as a man or woman in the world. Up until that point, you were a young adult male or a young adult female operating in the world with your brain not yet fully developed. Now that it's fully developed, now you must learn how to function in the world with a fully developed brain, which you did not have before, and your insights into different situations, relationships, circumstances, and so forth is going to be different. It's going to be more sharp and keen, especially if you engage in ritual practice and you cultivate yourself. So you go through that full solar cycle, that 365 and a quarter day cycle of living for the first time as a full-grown man, a full-grown woman. Now you're beginning to understand who you actually are and what your function in the world is and how to apply these different things. You moved into the past the 29th year and so forth, and now another concretization begins to take place. If you look at what takes place around the 29th or 30th year, what the white Star offspring calls Saturn return. The planet Saturn is governed by Amen in the Akan tradition and in Kemet and so forth. The female divinity is Men Menit, which is a title of Het Heru. So this is Men and Het Heru, men and quote unquote Hathor and so forth. It takes about 29 plus years, close to 30 years around average, between 29 and 30 years for Amen Men to make its full orbit around the Atenit, the sun, and return back to the same point. So once you have crossed into that 28th year and you've lived and functioned as a man or as a woman for a full solar cycle, then you have just moved also into that return of Amen Men. That's very key because, as we show in our publication, Amen Men, the divinity of Memenida, Saturday, and the planet Amen Men, in our Akradin Bosom series, and we also talk about it with regard to Afi or Het Heru. Amen Men governs the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. We said earlier that one of the terms for brain in ancient Kemet is Ehon, in our Akan tradition is Ehon. The other title for the brain is Amemini, and of course that's the divinity Amemini, and we show that the crown that Amen Men wears, which is the skull cap type crown with the long red ribbon falling from the back of the crown down to the floor, to the ground, that's the same central nervous system that is the brain and the spinal column. That's that crown that he wears. That's the crown of Amen Men inside of our bodies. So, just like we move into that 29th year after the brain is fully developed, we also have Amen Mini, the planet moving around and reaching its return right around that same time, and that concretizes the finalization of that brain development when Amen Mini, the one who governs the Amen Mini, the brain, manifests in that return. Now you've reached a certain level of development. Now, for example, you hear about in ancient Kemet, sometimes you hear people say it took 42 years for someone to become, or 40 years for someone to become a high priest in ancient Kemet. Sometimes you hear people say it took 40 years for someone to, go through the priesthood, or 42 years for someone to become a priest in ancient Kemet. Now, some people are repeating what Greeks were saying about our culture. in the late period, into the period when they had invaded the culture and so forth, and we began to just simply repeat certain things. Clement of Alexandria and some of these other Greeks reporting on what it took to be a priest in ancient Kemet and these different things. And by the time that they were reporting, of course, they had invaded. There was much that they did not know. It never took 40 years to become a priest or a priestess or a high priest or a high priestess in ancient Kemet. It did not take 40 years for the deity to begin to possess someone. That's not what's happening. What they're talking about with regard to that 40-year period and really a 42-year period is that next shift. There are two, from 28 to 35 and 35 to 42, those two next 7-year cycles. But there's a cycle within that as well. So once you hit that 29th year and you had a full cycle of living, functioning through the equinoxes and the solstices as a man or woman and taking in the energy of Ra and Ra'ed and wielding your energy through the patriclan and matriclan abosome that you have that are connected to you. And then Amenmene, the planet Amenmene, or so-called Saturn, has come back to its return to the place where it was when you were born and so forth, when you came into the world, when you incarnated into the world, and that concretized the finalization of that brain development for you, and now you're shifting into a new level of maturity and capacity to wield that life force energy that you've been given on a higher level to not only cultivate yourself, but influence your children so they can cultivate themselves and also positively impact and interface with other Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit adults who are on the same level for the purpose of nation building, restoration, and so forth, blending your energy complexes and applying your energy to the aspect of creation that you need to execute. If you're a healer, developing that healing, practice. If you're a builder, developing that practice. If you're an agriculturalist, dealing with the deities that govern, the fertility of the land in a harmonious way and, stimulating that energy so we can have food production and preservation. Every aspect of nation building is governed by different abosome. We are children of these different abosome. We have to wield the energy of these abosome so we can attune to them and fulfill that aspect of nation building that we were born to execute. When you become an adult, reach manhood and womanhood, go through that first year cycle of that first solar cycle, living as a man and woman, then you concretize your brain development through Amenmene, the return of Amenmene, close to that between 29th and 30th year and so forth. Then you can work with other mature adults. You're in the family building stage, you're in the nation building stage, and you can wield your life force energy ritually to engage that nation building process. There's another cycle that takes place after that. Just like it takes Amenmene around 29 years to go through that process and return to its point, you also have the planet Heru Kapet, which is governed by Heru, son of Alsar and Alset, which the white Sumerian offspring call Jupiter. We call Heru Upsheta, also Seba Res, the southern star, but Heru Upsheta, Heru of the opener of the sacred lands. And Heru Kapet is the major title of Saturn, but Heru Upsheta is Heru, the opener of the sacred lands, secret lands, hidden lands, and so forth. That is the planet, so-called Jupiter planet, which Jupiter is really Yao Pater or Father Yao. And Yao is the title of Heru in ancient Kemet, son of Alsar and Alset. Yao is also the title of divinity in the Akan traditions of people who are born on Thursday or Yauda, are born under the divinity Yao, which is Heru. That planet, which is the planetary home of that divinity, that governs, for example, on the male side, full-grown manhood and so forth, female side, full-grown womanhood. It takes that planet around 10 years on average, 10 years or more, to make its full return or full cycle. And that cycle is significant. after you've completed that 29 to 30 year cycle, right there with Amemini, then there's a new 10-year quote-unquote cycle of where Yao Pater or Heru, son of our son, are set in his planetary function, moves around. That same 10-year cycle is co-equal with the time it takes. We talked about the brain developing and not finishing its development until around the 28th or 29th year. And that coincides with the concretization and the full return of Amemini, the divinity that governs the brain and the central nervous system. The next 10-year cycle, every 10 years, around 10 years, and it becomes a little bit longer as we grow older, there's a 10-year cycle of development for the renewal of the skeletal system. So just like the brain, like certain cells renew themselves within 5 days and so forth, certain organs renew themselves within a couple of years. The skeletal system, it renews itself. About 10% of the skeletal system is renewed on a yearly basis, about 10 years or more. And when you get older, it takes a little bit longer. It takes about 10 years or more for the skeletal cells to fully replenish themselves. Cells dying and being reborn and so forth. You basically have a new skeletal system within about a 10-year period. When you're 0 to 10 years old, then 10 to 20, 20 to 30, but then once you get older, it takes a little bit longer and so forth. So you just went through that 28-year period with an extra year that led you to the 29th-year period. Around 29 or 30, your brain is fully developed. You have the capacity to wield that sacred energy in a harmonious, mature fashion and so forth. Then that next 10 years, from 30 to 40, there's a concretization and a renewal of that other infrastructure within your body, which is the skeletal system. That is the foundational structure within your body. Once that foundational structure is renewed once again after that 10-year period, you are into the 40th, 41st year of your life. Now you have been matured, you've been solidified, you've been concretized on a foundational level. Now you have the capacity to function as a quote-unquote high priest or high priestess because you've reached a level of development. It doesn't take 40 years for the deity to possess. If you were a priest or priestess, they were possessing you when you were in your 20s and 30s and so forth. But to function as a nana, an elder or elderess, first you have to have the physiological infrastructure of fully, after you reach manhood and womanhood, and function as a man and a woman for the first year and begin to wield that energy around the 29th to 30th year. Now you're functioning as a man and woman. Now you go through that next 10-year period as your skeletal system breaks down and regenerates itself as you're functioning as a man and a woman and be engaged in the nation-building process. While you're engaged in nation-building from the 30th year to the 41st year and so forth, while you're engaged in nation-building on a societal level, your body is engaged in the renewal of its nation-building or its foundational structure internally. But of course, that skeletal system that's being renewed over that next 10-year period or 11-year period is also a shrine for specific abosom. By the time you get to that 40th year, 41st year, and so forth, that shrine for the abosom has been renewed, that shrine has been fortified, that shrine has been edified, and you have been utilizing and wielding that energy in a harmonious fashion in that shrine during that time period. Internally for self-development and self-spiritual cultivation. Externally, it manifests through your works in the community, while not only you're rearing children on one hand, harmoniously, rearing them up in the culture, but you're also engaged in nation building and executing your function. And now you've reached that age of 40, 41, 42, and it's that transitional phase right there where you can have the responsibility and take on the responsibility of a high priest, high priestess, and so forth. You can function in that capacity. Some people want to become a high priest or high priestess or an elder and elderess when they're 22 and want to be called an elder or when they're 30 just because it makes them feel good and so forth. Just like a child at 12 doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to create human life because they haven't gone through puberty yet, physiologically, just like a young adult at 25 or 24 doesn't have the infrastructure physiologically, the fully developed brain, to wield the energy and the consciousness of the patriclan and matriclan bosom as an adult yet, because they don't have the infrastructure yet. In the same fashion, you don't have the capacity physiologically. You have not developed that new shrine, that skeletal system. The new shrine has not been renewed as a man and a woman. It was renewed for the first 10 years of life. Then it was renewed again from 10 to 20. It was renewed again from 20 to 30, but that's when you became a man or woman. Now you have to live as a man and a woman, a full-grown man and full-grown woman with a fully developed brain, and go through that next 10-year renewal process as a full-grown man and full-grown woman, and fortify that shrine once again. And now that it's fortified, now you move into the potential for becoming a nana, an elder, elderess, baba, iya, and so forth. If you've been, engaged in proper functioning, executing your functioning creation, and so forth. And so now you have ascended into the potential to execute that function as an elder or an elderess, priest or priestess, healer or healeress, and so forth. You have the physiological infrastructure and spiritual. This is where we also get, so you get into that 42nd year and so forth. This is where it's also directly calibrated to the 42 deities that are the assessors of Ma'at and Ma'al. And, of course, that's connected to the 42 Sepatu, or the 42 nomes of ancient Kemet and so forth. The divisions of the country governed by specific deities, each one of the divisions similar to 42 quote-unquote states in the country, just like we have 50 states. Here there are 42 Sepatu, or 42 nomes, or 42 divisions of the country. Each one is governed by the divinity. In the body you have 42 divisions and so forth, and it's the same thing here. It's directly calibrated with these 42 years, calibrated to these 42 divinities. And you don't ascend into that until you go through that process physiologically, but then, as we said earlier, your physiological development is commensurate with and should be commensurate with spiritual cultivation. The increase in power should be commensurate with an increase in responsibility, and it is up to you to cultivate yourself into that responsibility. But that, once again, points to the fact that there's a different level of development, a different level of functioning once you have physiologically reached that point after the 42nd year, moving into that 41st year, moving to the 42nd year, where you have a full development of that internal shrine, that foundational shrine, the skeletal system, a shrine of divinity. You have a different perspective and insight as you're operating through the world. That someone who has not gone through that, they do not have that. So if you're in your 40s and you're trying to date someone who's 25 and 26 and 27, there's going to be a disconnect. It's not just simply you all don't like the same music and things like that. Energically, they have not matured. Physiologically, they have not gone through that process. So they haven't even entered into the threshold of manhood and womanhood. They haven't entered into the threshold physiologically of the brain being fully developed around the 28th year and completing that process around the 29th year when Amen has come around. You'll notice that once they reach that process of Amen coming around the 29th year into the 30th year, once they get into 30, 31, 32, there's a shift and the maturity level increases. People who have not gone through that process yet, and they're still in their early, mid to late 20s, they cannot understand that process. They can't understand what we're talking about right now because they have not lived it. No different than someone can sit down and explain and teach someone about sexual activity, and someone can study human sexuality and get a degree in anthropology and a degree in human sexuality and so forth, but if they've never engaged the process, they can have a PhD and they don't know what they're talking about because they have never wielded the energy before, so they really don't know what they're talking about. They're just memorizing ideas. The same is true of someone who has not yet reached that level of physiological development and the capacity to wield the energy of the patriclan and matriclan abosom at these different shifts in life, chrono-biologically as well as spiritually. They can't understand the difference. Someone who is 26, 27 can't understand the way someone who is 30, 31 sees the world. They think there's no difference between a 27-year-old and a 25-year-old because when they were 25, they moved into being 27, there really was no change. There was no change physiologically, really, not much. They got a little bit more mature, but it wasn't much change. It wasn't, brain-wise, it was a very slight change. Physiologically, their body is basically the same. So a couple of years difference to them is not a big deal. When they look back when they were between 22 and 24, it wasn't a big deal, a shift physiologically or cognitively. So they're thinking, well, I'm 27 and someone else is 29 or 30. That's only a couple of years. There's really no difference between the two, but there's a major difference. There's a major difference from that shift to young adulthood to actually entering the threshold of manhood and womanhood. So there's a big shift and there's a big difference and there's a great distance between someone who is beyond 42, gone into that next, they're into their seventh cycle of 7 years. They completed the sixth cycle at 42, and now they're into their seventh cycle of 7 years, going towards 49, which is 7 cycles of 7. The big difference between someone who has gone through that point and renewed their skeletal shrine once again and can wield that energy differently than someone who is 27 or 28. And it's an imbalanced relationship because they haven't even crossed the threshold into manhood and womanhood. And even the ones who have at 28, they haven't lived as a man or woman yet until they get into 29, 30, and into 31 and so forth. So there's a shift there. Then we have to, of course, talk about transcarnationally. We talked about, physiologically and what's happening in this particular lifetime, but transcarnationally, a maturity level. That does not trump what happens biologically, but it does influence what's taking place and how people approach certain issues. We've talked about, in our broadcast, overcoming transcarnational suffering, intergenerational and transcarnational suffering. There are some times when people lived in a previous lifetime, they were engaged in self-destructive behavior. They died in that state where they were still engaged in self-destructive behavior. They're operating at a lower level of the spirit realm, in the ancestral realm, like someone who's been cut and the wound is still open and it keeps getting reopened and so forth and infected. They return into the world through a branch of the family who's operating. They're drawn into the world through a branch of the family that's not as strong, that's operating at the same low frequency as they are. And they're drawn into a womb and born back into the world, but that wound can still be opened, and it's still open to infection. And just like a regular physical wound, if you have a cut and it's open and you haven't put anything like aloe vera in it to heal and help protect it and cover it so parasites don't enter and cause a problem, then there can be a parasitic infection until the scab forms so it protects the wound as it's healing up under the scab. We can have a wound in our spirit body, in our aura, so to speak, meaning it's porous, and we reincarnate in that fashion. And then we have that open wound that was never closed because we were engaged in self-destructive behavior, and we never cultivated ourselves and strengthened ourselves and increased our spiritual immunity. So we have that open wound, and parasitic entities, those kind of individuals, living individuals who are parasitic and drawn to negativity, are drawn to that open wound like viral agents, and then discarnate spirits of relatives and non-relatives are drawn like parasites to that open wound, and that person draws negativity to themselves based on what they were doing in previous lifetimes. Even when they get on track and begin to engage some cultural development and spiritual cultivation and so forth, they still have to be engaged in the process of closing up that wound and healing these other, conditionings that they've had and so forth, and that can affect maturity level as well. If somebody is, even if they're on the same age level, but they're not, the other individual is not going through that same process, they may not want to deal with some of that because they're not accustomed to dealing with it. They may not be spiritually cultivated yet enough to deal with that kind of, trauma that the individual is going through. Maybe that individual that's going through that kind of trauma doesn't need to be involved with somebody at that point. They need to work on themselves for a while before they start trying to draw other people into this situation while that wound is still open. And then, of course, you have other situations where people, come through a weaker branch of the family that we talked about before in the AKANFO broadcast, not because they were spiritually uncultivated in a previous lifetime, but they were spiritually cultivated elders and eldresses, NTORO. They transitioned, became NTORO, spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors. And they see that there's a specific branch of the family that's weaker, and they come through that branch to strengthen that branch. So they're going into, quote unquote, as we said, like a burning building. They're going into an area like going into a crime-ridden neighborhood, somebody renting a condo or renting an apartment or buying a house in a very rundown, crime-ridden neighborhood because they want to establish a community center and they want to clean up the neighborhood and they want to transform people and they want to build institutions and get our people off of drugs and crime and everything else. They know what they are going into, and they know they may not make it out of that, but they're going into it anyway because they have a mission, they have a function, and they're going to execute their function or mission, whether it ends in their transition, early transition, or not. So some people come into that situation, they engage that kind of process, and then a male or female they come in contact with that they want to engage in relationship, that person is not going through that kind of spiritual cultivation. They're not going through that kind of situation. So they see that this intelligent, brilliant, spiritually cultivated sister is going through this kind of drama, and they're wondering, why are you placing yourself in this kind of drama? Or a woman sees a man going through some kind of, surrounded by a great deal of drama, even though the person himself or herself, in this case himself, is not, controlled by that negativity, but they're in the midst of negativity trying to, bring some change, and the other individual can't see, well, why are you stuck in that situation? You're too intelligent for that. You need to, come over here and just live a more comfortable life. What are you doing? They can't see that because there's a certain maturity level that they don't have. And sometimes that has nothing to do with the age function, but sometimes it does have to do with the age function. We're talking about transcarnational, through reincarnation, different incarnations coming back into certain blood circles and so forth. Some people were engaged in spiritual cultivation in a previous lifetime. They come into the world more spiritually mature, and their spiritual cultivation moves much quicker and is more expansive than someone who is less cultivated in a previous lifetime, and they come in and they're trying to engage the spiritual cultivation process, and they're having a more difficult time. And then that compounded with a distance in biological age, chrono-biological age, and so forth, can put strains on relationships. So we need to understand the dynamics chronobiologically with regard to age, with regard to life cycles, solar cycles. That's inclusive of the great year cycle, because when we're talking about the great year cycle, we're talking about the so-called zodiac, talking about the constellations that cross the ecliptic. Those constellations are collections of stars that generate a specific configuration of energy, and therefore they become a shrine that resonates at a frequency for a specific abosom. And then we're born into the world and sent into the world under the governance of that specific abosom, indicating to the community who we were assigned to pre-incarnation, and we carry that energy into the world. So we need to understand how that impacts us in harmony with the divinity that governs our crop. So all of these things are factors with regard to making decisions about relationships. These specific age factors, these different shifts in consciousness, physiological development, spiritual cultivation, and so forth, all of these things must be factored in. Okay, so we're going to, in the KAMIT, HENA, and NTORO, we talk about some of these patriclan and matriclan divinities, and we have a short section on that in that particular book. In the book, when we listed these books in the promotional piece for the show, we have the OKRA complex, the soul of AKANFO, where we deal with the nature of the KRA, the soul, the divine consciousness, our divine function, the NKRA and NKRABIA, the male and female aspects of our divine function. We also talk about the She and the Shibia, the male and female aspects of that divine energy from the patriclan and matriclan abosom that we receive from our mother and father through our genetic material, the DNA from the father, DNA from the mother, and then the energy that animates the sperm cell of the father and animates the sperm ovum cell of the mother. Those patriclan and matriclan divinities that fuse together, and we have access to that energy to wield it in a unique fashion based on our function in creation. We talk about that, She and Shebia, in the book as well, so you can get detailed information about that. Okay, so if there are any questions or comments on the phone line, hit the number 1. If you have any questions or comments in the chat room, you can hit those. For those who came in a little bit later, we were talking about, we mentioned the Hapi Merit retreat, and of course, this year, 13,018, started on the Fida, which is a Friday, and of course, that colors the energy of the year. This is a year that's governed by Afi, Het Heru, and of course, this is our first annual retreat, Hapi Merit, dealing with manhood and womanhood for a strong foundation for Ojiraman, the purified nation, and so forth. For those who tuned in to a previous broadcast, the last broadcast, which was last Yauda on Amain Semda, Affairs of the Nation Day, we talked about we had about 3 spaces left because of cancellations. Now we have 2 spaces left in the Hapi Merit retreat. So if you would like to attend that retreat, go to the Hapi Merit page. We had a couple of people said they were interested. So it's really the last 2 spaces. It's first come, first served, basically. So whoever gets those, and then registration would be closed once again. It was closed a couple of weeks back, but we had a couple of last-minute cancellations, and because of that, a couple of spaces opened up. So if you would like to attend the retreat in February, you can go to the Hapi Merit page on our website and register for the retreat there. Okay, we have a question on the phone line. Okay, Michelle on the phone line, number 8162. You had a question or a comment?
What's up?
What's up?
I was wondering what these cycles mean for the spiritual development of those of us who have come into ancestral knowledge late in life. Like, for instance, I didn't find out about different things until I was 38, and now I'm coming up on my 42nd shift. It almost sounds like, spiritually, someone in that position is kind of like someone who's mentally disabled and like a 5-year-old in an adult body.
Well, no. So what happens physiologically, of course, your brain engaged, fully developed that pruning process with regard to the synapses and the white matter and so forth. That all took place around the time you were 28, 29. You probably recognize a shift in your consciousness and a maturity level that shifted by the time you were 29, 30, 31, 32, around that time. So that's still happening. Now, we say that a shift in physiologically and a shift in energy should be commensurate with a shift in, spiritual cultivation. But most of us, we were trained to go to church and all this other stuff. So what ends up happening, and you'll notice this, but what ends up happening is even though you had the physiological shift and there was, maturity, maturation in the physical body and in the brain, but you didn't have that information, what happens is once you get the information, sometimes it seems like it's overwhelming because it's like you're on an accelerated learning track and you get flooded with information dealing with spirituality and culture and ancestral religion and everything else. And there's no problem with that. That's just what happens. That's what is taking place. We get all this information. We get flooded with it. Most of us get this information once we are grown because we were not raised in ancestral religion, fully. some of our people were, we had certain family members who were involved in hoodoo and juju and voodoo and so forth, and certain things were being done, but it wasn't like 100% of the time, all day, every day for our entire lives. So there are certain things that we were doing and certain things that we didn't know, and we didn't get fully engrossed in it until we were grown and started learning. So it's just an accelerated learning track. But the shift physiologically is going to take place, and it already happens. That's just going to take place no matter what. And then what we do with the shift in consciousness, you have the energy as well within you. You were born with, the energy of your matriclan and patriclan abosom. The abusi abosom, you incarnated in the world connected to that divinity. And the ejabosom, you were incarnated in the world with that divinity. Now, we tend to neglect the energy because we don't know we have it. It's very similar to, sometimes people will say when they were a child, they were more clairvoyant, and they could see an ancestral spirit or, hear them or feel them and so forth. But because of this culture, they were taught to be afraid of that, and they basically shut that capacity down. And then they shut it down for 20 or so years, 25 years, and then they started learning about ancestral culture and realized it's okay. In fact, that's something that they should be engaged in, and they started remembering when they were a child they used to be, able to do that. Then they establish an ancestral shrine and engage in ritual practice, and then it comes back. So it wasn't that they didn't have it. It was just suppressed for a while. And it's the same thing here. So you're going to go through the shift physiologically. That's going to happen. You were already born with the tumi, or the power associated with each abosom divinity that's connected to you. It may have been suppressed or neglected to a certain extent because you didn't know you had that, or you didn't know what to do with it, or it may have flared up every now and then and you didn't know what was going on. But now that you've, returned consciously to embrace your culture deliberately and consciously, it's just going to be a flood of information. And you just have to wield that flood of information. You just have to navigate your way. And, it may be overwhelming to a certain extent at certain points, but that's where you have, a more intense focus on ancestral communication. Like some people may, go to the shrine on a weekly basis. Some of us will go to the shrine on a daily basis because we just have to, navigate and negotiate this flood of information that's coming through and properly place it. And that's no problem. That's just that's the situation we find ourselves in. It's no different than if we were on a plantation and we escaped. We had to hurry up and figure out how to survive outside of the plantation, and our people did that. And we have the capacity to catch up. That's the key.
Okay. Thank you for answering my question. That's it.
Okay. Yeni Aseda. Appreciate the call. Okay. Call on the phone line, number 1295. You had a question or a comment?
It's Yo.
What's up?
Yo, so what about those of us who used to smoke Big Dro from like 21 to 28 and so on? How well does the Abatum recover from that abuse, and how much does that affect the process you're talking about now?
Well, two things that happen with that. So, and that's whether it's that or it could be anything. It could be cocaine, it could be heroin, it could be alcohol, it could be anything that you put in your system that negatively affects your system. Now, it can affect your system in a negative capacity once you, first things first, you purge that from your system. Now, with regard to, it's two basic things. With regard to physiologically, of course, any substance like that can damage tissues or things like that. You get on a holistic diet to help begin to repair, cells and things like that. When people are engaged in smoking, drinking, and so forth, they're not able to sanction the influx of thoughts and transmissions of their own, as well as, someone's high or something like that. They're not able to sanction the various thoughts or influences coming in. They open themselves up to suggestions and communications from discarnate relatives and non-relatives. It lowers your spiritual immunity. And just like someone who's drunk can't, make sharp, quick decisions, like if they're driving and so forth, because they are impaired, their decision-making is impaired. The same thing happens spiritually. Your decision-making is impaired. You open up, pores, open up the pores in your spirit body, in your kahibit, in your aura, and then, parasites can get in and they begin to drop ideas and drop influences and notions and beliefs and pushing you towards certain things, and you have pulls and pushes that you're thinking are yours, but maybe they're not yours and things like that, and that pushes people in different directions. So first, you get the poison out of the system. Of course, you engage a holistic diet to help repair whatever you need to repair. But once you do that, then once you start engaging the ritual process and you're focused dealing with the nananom and samanfo, the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors of your, blood circle, then they can repel any of those negative type entities who had tried to attach themselves to you previously, who are trying to influence you. Just like, you invite family members over to the house. Anybody who's trying to break in the house previously, they have, some group of people who's not going to allow them to do that. So that can be overcome as well. So
restoration is always possible as long as the OKRAA or the OKRAA is not separated from the person's head, basically.
Right. And even if there was some dislocation of the KRA temporarily, the person will suffer in different ways. Sometimes they will suffer like a major illness. Sometimes they will suffer like major depression and so forth. Sometimes they will suffer to the extent that they feel like, there's some manifestation of spiritual discordance or mental illness to a certain extent, and it appears that way on the outside. But once they realign themselves with the abosom and their umsamanfo, even that dislocation can be realigned. It only becomes totally detached when people are deliberately engaged in consistent, deliberate criminal type action. Then it just separates totally. But most of our people don't engage in that kind of stuff. They just, may be neglectful or self-destructive, and at most they become disaligned and becomes dislocated to a certain extent, and they suffer for a while until they become intently focused. But yes, restoration in that sense is always, a possibility.
Okay. Ashe. Medase. You have a good night, man. Majo.
Okay. Appreciate the call. Okay. Michio on the phone line, number 7071. You got a question or comment?
Michio Ajira Kwesi. My question is in regards to, basically you kind of answered it with the last two questions. But when we go through, because you talked about towards the end about sometimes the age difference and then our development phases and all that stuff may put a strain on relationships along with, what our functions are. Is it possible when we're in situations, well, I think I probably answered my own question. Okay, so when we're in relationships with people, regardless if they're romantic or not, would it be a sign that we're on the right track when we start seeing manifestations of, let's say, our divine purpose starting to really manifest to us, or that, ourselves and another person or other people that we're involved with, things start happening? Like, how do we know through the signs of those things that we're really on the right track? Because sometimes we can get caught up in certain situations with people and think that we're going the right way, but then it's not necessarily so, because wherever, however much time goes by, eventually those relationships may end. And they may not end on a good note.
Right. So the way to basically divine the signs, whether it's, certain people showing up who are children of certain abosom, or answer a question or bring some information that abosom share with you at the shrine or in a dream or something like that, or certain achinebo animal totems show up at certain junctures when you're thinking about a certain thing, or just situations and events and circumstances that they place you in. the way to divine those signs, it still goes back to the consistent invocation of the abosom, evocation of the Nsamanfo ritually at the shrine, to the extent that you begin to you're comfortable with the way that they communicate and the way they show you signs. Because people's relatives show them and communicate with them in different ways. Some of them will send animal totems all the time. Some of them will send people who are children of the same divinity all the time. They'll show up, keep running into a sister's name, Amma, or something like that, and they just keep putting them in your pathway, answering questions or them saying things incidentally that happen to coincide with what they showed you in a dream or at the shrine and so forth, or the questions that you had being answered. So the unique way in which your people communicate, with that, the notion of Bede, we're talking about age, but Bede, which is time, Bede means time, it also means space, it also means way or manner, and that's why we have we call the ancestral shrine the Nkom Bede, Nkom meaning spiritual communication, Bede means space, Bede means time, and Bede also means manner, so it's a spiritual communication, Nkom, special space, ritual space, done at a specific time, Bede, in a specific space, Bede, and in a specific manner, Bede, all dealing with sacred time, space, and manner. So the more you engage that Nkombere, that Nsama Nkombere ancestral shrine, space, way, and manner, the more comfortable you become with the manner in which they communicate with you specifically. And then this notion of Bede or time, you do have time. There's no rush. So if you're uncomfortable or unsure, you don't have to jump out the window on anything. You still have Bede, you still have time, which is governed by Tehuti and Seshat. They're regulating time, and they're also regulating what things you should be engaged in, how they fit in your divine function, and so forth. So there's no rush to anything. Sometimes we're like, if this isn't working right now, maybe, it's like we're so intense that we're ready, everything's either going to fall apart or it's all going to work. But there's no race, there's no rush. We can relax. There's no gun to your head, so you can chill and confirm it through Bede, through time, and they'll confirm it through Bede in a specific manner, the manner in which your people communicate with you, and through Bede in a specific space, whether it's at the shrine or in the dream state or in the course of every day when they throw these people out or send these people out. You can divine those signs, and the way you divine the signs that they send you is through consistent communication with them. And it goes back to the same thing like when we talked about the more time Bede, the new parents spend with the baby, the more they're able to divine the different cries that the baby has, to the extent where within a few months it's very easy for the mother to tell whether it's a cry for a need for food, or a cry because they're in pain, or a cry because they need to be changed, or a cry because they're tired. So at first it's not that apparent because it all sounds like the same crying, but within, consistent communication and interfacing, then she can divine the signs rather quickly because she knows the way the baby communicates. And it's the same thing with the shrines.
Okay. Now, is it also possible that, because I know everything boils down to a choice that we have, but is it also possible to allow ourselves to not ever fulfill our divine functions, like still remain in a position of constant confusion? Is that something that, like will we leave this earth before we, because I know sometimes you talked about like some people may not be able to fulfill their divine function while they're here in this incarnation, and they may have to do it another time. But is it like possible that we, what if like on some level we don't mature well enough or mature to the degree that maybe we should be, and we don't fulfill our divine function while we're here on this incarnation? Is that like a sign that our cry is about to leave us, or what's that?
No, that's not a sign that your cry is about to leave you, and it's not a thing where, because there's a difference there's a nuanced difference, because sometimes you will hear that notion, and it comes from Buddhism, like, if you don't fulfill or some forms of Hinduism, if you don't fulfill your, quote unquote role, and they don't even know what a function is, then you'll be, quote unquote, like cursed to have to come back to earth, because the real key is once you become enlightened, then you don't have to suffer through the cycle of reincarnation, which is nonsense. The whites and their offspring think reincarnation is, a death sentence, because they are incarnating into a degenerate body. They're incarnating into, the Earth Mother, which is really foreign to them because they're spirits of disorder. So for them, incarnation into flesh and into the world is, horrific, and they want to escape the cycle of reincarnation. Or in the West, they want to go to heaven and all this other nonsense. But for us, the Earth Mother is a divinity. This is sacred. It's a privilege to be operating through a melanin-dominant body in the world. So that's the thing. But yes, people regularly, and especially in our culture here, regularly transition without fulfilling their function. People are married to crackers and, doing all kinds of nonsense and, dying like that, and then they realize, or believing in a fictional cartoon character, Jesus, who never existed. And then as soon as they make their transition and their body separates, the spirit separates from the body, they recognize instantly, of course, now they're in the space, they're in the place, they're in the spot, and Jesus is not there, and neither is Muhammad or none of them other crackers are there. So they realize that they wasted their entire life waiting on this cracker, and he's nowhere to be found. He's missing in action. So that happens regularly. So yes, people can transition. But typically for us, if we're not engaged in like insane behavior like child molestation, rape, murder, and all of that kind of thing, our cry is not separating forever. It's just dislocated because it's been neglected. And it's like somebody can, waste their life away by becoming an alcoholic, and they look up in 25 years, they've been drinking for 25 years and wasted all kinds of time and so forth. In the same fashion, someone can continue to do that, or just not be an alcoholic or doing drugs, but just not executing their function, just living according to this culture and neglecting themselves and trying to fill in the empty spaces with reality TV or, relationships, sexual activity, or, alcohol or parties or something that stimulates their senses temporarily. And then they transition, and they never feel themselves. And when they make that transition, they realize that, they didn't do what they needed to do. And then they're in the ancestral realm, and they're still uncultivated. They're not in a comfortable place in the ancestral realm. They're still conflicted like they were when they were here. Now, they can engage some spiritual cultivation while they're there, and they can return here and, execute their function properly. But, yes, people on a regular basis make their transition. There are many of our people. The majority of our people transition without executing their function now because millions of our people are believing in a fictional cartoon character. And they don't realize it until they transition. So there's a backlog of ancestresses and ancestors which, have recognized once they transition that they wasted their time, and they're not happy about that. But that goes back to the question the previous caller asked about, that Ajwa asked, or Kotwa asked about, with regard to incarnation and so forth. And when I talk about an accelerated learning process, some of those ancestresses and ancestors, because they transition and they realize that, they were praying to a fictional cartoon character all this time, now they can look at their descendants, their people that they left on earth who are still living on earth and so forth, and they see all of them still praying to the cracker, and they're trying to inform them, their nieces and nephews and grandchildren and all of that, and none of them are listening because they've been conditioned to only listen to the fictional cartoon character. And then they see you going to the shrine, and you're the only one in the whole clan that's going to the shrine. And for the first time, they're like, wait a minute, she's pouring libation, she's calling on us. And so they all rush you, and you get kind of overwhelmed with all this energy because they see that you're the only one paying attention, so they're going to jump you. And that happens to a lot of us because there's such a backlog of ancestral spirits who are trying to communicate, and most of our people are not paying attention because they've been conditioned to be fearful and think that anything that's not a fictional character is demonic. So we end up being overloaded to a certain extent, but that's just the way it is. We just like if somebody escaped from enslavement, they'll come back and bring 20 people with them. We ride with them, you know what I'm saying, because we figured out a way to get out, so we're going to go back and get the rest of our people.
Gotcha. What I say?
Okay, maybe I'll say that. We appreciate the call. Okay, so we have one call left on the phone line. Michelle, we're on the phone line.
Hello?
Is that a question or a comment? Yes.
Yes. I wanted to ask, you were saying that there is like when you return, sometimes you have like an emotional wound, and you might draw parasitic people onto you. Is that, well, from my experience, like I've experienced people with narcissism. Like for instance, when I researched what exactly I was dealing with, or who I was dealing with, the person seemed to have narcissism. I was always curious to know from an ancestral perspective what this disorder is about and why it is so prevalent and what it means for the person's soul. And I mean, is it curable? I'm just trying to understand what it is about from our perspective.
Yes. You said narcissism, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to shed some light on it from this perspective instead of like from
right.
Well, most of what I've heard before is like from a white cultural perspective. I've never heard it from like ancestral culture perspective then.
Okay. So that disorder as well as, the various disorders, it depends on what's going on with the person. Some people can manifest a narcissistic personality disorder because they were uncultivated in a previous lifetime and they did have those open wounds and so forth, and they came back through and they're still operating on that, uncultivated level. There are other people that didn't happen in a previous lifetime. They came here as children. They may have been molested, went through trauma and so forth, and the manner in which they built up a defense was to manifest a narcissistic personality. Now, some other people, they go through trauma, child molestation, physical abuse and abandonment and so forth, may have gone through the foster care system, whatever it is, and they can't handle it, so they get on drugs. Or they simply manifest bipolar disorder or something like that, and they just kind of check out of reality. Some other people, they're a little bit stronger in their spiritual constitution, but they're still emotionally unstable, so they're not going to give up, but the way they fight back is to develop a defense by everything is going to revolve around them, and that's how they defend themselves. Some people, it's not even when they were children. Sometimes it's not until it happened when they were adults or, young adults, and something traumatic happened. It could be something as simple as, a certain girl didn't like them or a certain man didn't like them and so forth, and they were distraught by that because they didn't know how to handle it. They didn't have the capacity. They didn't learn spiritually and emotionally how to handle rejection and so forth, and there was something that they felt was missing within them, so they developed that kind of personality because, they were, picked on or, misused to a certain extent. So the provenance of the disorder, it depends on the person. It could come from something that happened in this lifetime. It could come from something that happened in a previous lifetime. It could come from a combination of both. So it depends. But, yes, it can be eradicated because all spiritual disorders or so-called mental disorders outside of some, physiological issue, like a traumatic brain injury. Like some people have a traumatic brain injury and then they, their motor skills are impaired, severely because they got damaged, their nerves got damaged and so forth. But outside of something like that or some chemical imbalance where somebody spiked their drink or something and they've been suffering ever since, there's not a physical issue. When it's purely non-physical, and even sometimes when people start engaging in self-destructive behavior, it causes chemical, imbalances as well. But if it's something, outside of a major physical problem, it can be restored because all of behavioral illness fundamentally is some measure of disalignment from the krawa. That's what mental illness is. When you're aligned with your krawa, then you're in harmony with order. When you're disaligned from it, then you're disjointed and you're making decisions, thoughts, intentions, and actions that are out of harmony with reality, the function you should be executing. And when you operate out of harmony with reality, that's the definition of insanity. Now, some of us neglect our kra, and we're still connected, but we're just not paying attention, and we're just kind of self-destructive and do things that are kind of self-destructive every now and then. But some people kind of really suppress it and just go in the other direction, and that's when they manifest that kind of disordered behavior. But the key is the realignment, and it comes through ritual and sitting down with a therapist, once a week for 40 minutes for a few years. That typically is not going to do that, and then they put you on medication and things like that. Sometimes, effectively, people will realign because what happens is them just sitting down and paying attention to somebody and not focusing on other things. At some point, they get tired of acting the way they're acting, and they're like, let me just start realigning with my crowd like I should have been doing the whole time. They don't use those terms, but instinctively, that's what they're drawn to do because they're tired of what they've been going through. And then the therapist will think it had something to do with their therapeutic intervention, which it had nothing to do with that at all. And then they'll pat themselves on the back for, helping to cure the person. But
because they're always saying that it cannot be fixed, especially because the person is they never seem to be accountable for anything or conscious that they're actually hurting others. So that is why I was always wondering if these persons can ever fix themselves. Without the knowledge of
right now. Now if they're engaged in some really negative behavior, sometimes if it's really that kind of negative antisocial type behavior, some of them the crowd may have separated. They're really criminal types. But then you have other ones who are kind of extreme, but this culture supports that. It supports that. It reaffirms that kind of behavior because they may have people in the world that they come in contact with saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. But nobody's telling them, hey, you're out of alignment with your kra and your divine function, and you have discarnate spirits that are influencing you and you're going along with it because you're not trying to cultivate yourself. There's no infrastructure for them to see that there's a different way to function. This culture supports people who step all over people and use force to control people and dominate people, and they just sometimes pretend like there are extremes to it, but in general, you should be doing that. That's what the president do. That's what the Congress does. That's what police do. That's what this culture is built on. So it's made for narcissistic personalities. They're fed, and supported every step of the way. So it just depends on the person. It depends on how far gone they actually are. But if there's just a dislocation from the kra, yes, they can reconnect. And sometimes it takes another traumatic experience, like a life-threatening experience, for them to, decide they're going to move in a different direction.
Okay. All right.
Or people just cutting them off totally,
Okay. Right. Because, it was really on my mind because I've had, experience with someone like that. And it still bothers me, and it actually see them carry on as if, the past has never existed. It's kind of, painful to watch something like that. So I really had to ask,
Right.
Yes.
But yeah, it depends on what the situation. But yeah, there are different origins of it. But most of them can come out of it. But sometimes, like I said, it takes sometimes a very traumatic experience for them to go through, or just everybody they interface with, who they exercise that influence or control over, to 100%. Cut them off totally and not give them another chance to, wield that negative influence over them, and then they have nobody to exercise control over, and that's in of itself becomes traumatic for a narcissist to not be able to control somebody because everybody cut them off because they need to be fed that attention. But when people cut the attention off, that's like, homicide as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, I realize. But it's as if there always seems to be somebody, though. Because the fact that a lot of us have, our own trauma, is as if it makes us susceptible. It's as if there's always somebody out there who will be vulnerable to that type of influence.
Right. And what often happens is individuals end up putting themselves in positions where they get their lives threatened because they come in contact with the wrong kind of person after a while.
Yeah.
And then, it comes to a head. So, and then they have to deal with it.
Okay.
Okay, so we appreciate the call.
Yes.
What were you saying?
Saying thanks for answering.
Okay, we appreciate it. I said.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we just I just want to make sure we didn't have any other calls on the phone line. All right. Okay, so we're going to end the broadcast here. We just also wanted to say it's only a few minutes left in the broadcast, so we're going to end it here. Also, if you, for those who heard the previous broadcast, we are still taking, of course, orders for our Black Swan Life T-shirts. If you go to the Black Swan Life page, you'll see the information. You'll see the T-shirts that we have. It's, of course, in harmony with this whole notion of Heru governing this year. The image of that black swan is showing that that's that natural, elegant image is naturally a beautiful image. It doesn't need any enhancements. Like we use that line talking about a swan wouldn't be told they need to have neck implants to be beautiful. They would understand that their intrinsic nature is what makes them beautiful. It's the same thing with our standard of beauty as Afurakani people, and that impacts the minds and consciousness of our women, girls, and our community. So when you look at the Medusa, the hieroglyphs on the shirt, and the animal totem, and the Queen Mother, Henut, Ames Nefertari, and the Sankofa symbol, and the sacred waters, and so forth, and of course the quote is on the back, this is part of that movement. So please support that movement. You can purchase one or more shirts. Again, we're trying to get to that point. We want to do that this week, as a matter of fact, to make an order, a bulk order with the black printer. We didn't want to have to use the non-black printer. We have to get a certain number of shirts before we can make a bulk order, a first order to print with the black printer. So when you make the purchase, that will assist us to get to that point so that we can, employ a black business to engage this process all the way through. So you'll see that on our website, ojidafo.com/blackswanlife.html, and you can email us as well with information. You will see all the information. You'll see the back and front of the shirt. You'll see the detailed cosmological information. You'll also see the video that we put forward, and we also did a broadcast going into detail about that cosmology. So, again, Yedase, we thank you for tuning in to the broadcast, and Yebe Shiabio, we will meet again. That's up.